The movie begins with our now elderly protagonist, Paul Edgecombe, alongside fellow residents of his retirement home, immersed in a movie on television. Suddenly, something in the film strikes a memory within Paul's past, overwhelming him with emotions as he leaves the room to gather himself. Elaine, a friend from the residence, follows him. Curious about Paul's reaction, Elaine asks about it. Paul reveals to her that the film stirred up memories from his past, a time when he was a prison guard responsible for the inmates on death row. When Paul begins to recount his tale, we will get back in time to a prison known as the Green Mile, infamous for housing those condemned to death. Here we meet Paul's younger self, who is the leader of the guard unit at the prison. He is a strong figure who, despite being under a huge pain due to his urinary system infection, maintains a powerful presence. Paul's team of guards consists of the devoted Brutus, dependable Harry, competent Dean, and the problematic Percy. As Paul and his team ready themselves to receive new inmates, we see a prison truck arrive. The first prisoner is escorted by Percy, a guard known for his arrogance and cruelty, as the prisoner steps off the truck and into the block. The guards, as well as another prisoner named Edward, are taken aback by the sheer size of the new arrival. Percy, attempting to assert his dominance harshly, orders the massive man into his cell, delivering a sharp blow to his chest. Paul intervenes, calling out Percy for his unnecessary brutality. Through this action, it becomes clear that Paul is a man of integrity, humility, and responsibility. Paul then takes the opportunity to read the prisoner's file and introduces himself and the other guards to the newcomer. His name is John Coffey. Before Paul and his team leave, John pleads in a soft voice for them not to extinguish the lights in his cell as he is fearful of the dark. Paul assures him that some lights will remain on in the corridor throughout the night. Despite John's intimidating size and physical strength, this interaction reveals his gentleness and vulnerability, displaying his character as profoundly human and delicate on the inside. Later, Paul delves deeper into John's past, reading the documents that detail the series of events leading to John's death sentence in a rural area. A family is gripped by panic as their two young daughters have mysteriously vanished. A frantic search begins abruptly, ending when they hear a gut-wrenching scream. It is John, weeping uncontrollably with the lifeless girls in his arms, their bodies marked by violence. An officer forces John onto the ground, placing him under arrest for murder. Just as Paul is about to finish reading John's file, Warden Hal approaches him. He mentions an angry call he received from the state capitol. It seems Percy is related to high-ranking officials. He's the nephew of the governor's wife. Paul shares his concerns about Percy remaining in the ranks, fearing that his violent tendencies could harm the inmates. Hal, however, asks Paul to be patient. He shares that Percy plans on leaving soon for a position at Briar Ridge Mental Hospital. This leaves Paul wondering why Percy hasn't left already, given his influential connections. Paul suspects Percy is delaying his departure because he has a morbid fascination with witnessing an execution on the prison's electric chair. At home, Paul mentions his frustrations about his painful infection. Jan, understanding and compassionate, comfort him. The following day, the guards discover a mouse inside the prison. Brutus offers it a piece of biscuit, which the mouse accepts before heading back into the cell. Intrigued by the mouse's origins, the guards decide to search the cell. They empty out the contents, but they fail to find any trace of the little creature. Soon after, Paul and his team shave off the hair from the head of a prisoner named Arlen. Prepping him for the grim procedure, Arlen is then escorted to the imposing electric chair. Brutus places a wet sponge on Arlen's head, a method that ensures the electricity will directly target the brain, speeding up the process of death. Once everything is set, Brutus instructs the officers to engage the electric lever. A rush of electricity courses through the prisoner, ending his life swiftly while Percy watches the whole scene from a small adjoining room. After this, Paul confronts Percy about his job application at the Briar Ridge Mental Hospital. Percy acknowledges this and strikes a deal. He'll leave the prison if he gets to order an execution just once, suggesting this cruel desire has been his motivation all along. Considering the potential benefit of Percy's departure, Paul contemplates granting his request to prompt his exit. The next morning, Paul finds prisoner Edward tearfully interacting with the mouse they found earlier. Edward has befriended the creature fondly, naming it Mr. Jingles and enjoying its company. Later that afternoon, Warden Hall summons Paul to tell him about an upcoming inmate transfer. A man known as Wild Bill, convicted of murdering 3 people, is scheduled to arrive the next day after sharing the grim news. Hal confides in Paul about his wife, Melinda's health condition. She has been diagnosed with a brain tumor. The doctors can't operate as the tumor is too deep within her brain, leaving her fate uncertain. Hall is visibly devastated, consumed with worry and fear of losing his long-term partner. His heartbreaking revelation paints an emotional picture, reminding us that even those in charge are not immune to personal tragedies. In the middle of the night, Paul awakens gripped by agonizing pain from his relentless infection. He stumbles to the bathroom, urinating near a pile of wood, before collapsing from the excruciating discomfort. His health condition is deteriorating rapidly. As morning breaks, Paul shares with his wife how his infection has worsened. He's determined to consult a doctor, an option he's avoided due to his demanding duties at the prison. At the same time, the arrival of the new inmate Wild Bill, a mental patient with a deadly past, is imminent. While a team of guards goes to collect him from the mental hospital, Paul anxiously waits in the prison from behind his bars. John warns the others about the incoming prisoner as if he senses a dangerous area surrounding the man. When Wild Bill arrives, chaos ensues. Without warning, he strikes Percy and begins strangling Dean with his handcuffs. Paul rushes to Jin's aid, but Wild Bill lands a powerful kick to Paul, causing him to crumble in pain. Paul attempts to regain control, pointing his gun at Wild Bill, but holds off from shooting. Fortunately, Brutus steps in, landing a blow to Wild Bill's head that renders him unconscious. Once Wild Bill is safely locked away in his cell, Paul's ongoing pain intensifies, causing him to collapse from his cell. John signals Paul, urging him to come closer. Suddenly, John reaches out, grabbing Paul in the area where he's experiencing the most pain. Edward, witnessing what appears to be an aggressive act, cries out for help, but his calls go unheard as quickly as it began. The interaction ends. John lets go of Paul, and a strange dark cloud escapes from his mouth, hovering in the air briefly before vanishing. It's as though John has performed some sort of mysterious act. Paul asks John what he's done, to which John simply replies, "I helped," before drifting off to his bed. Bewildered, Paul makes his way to the toilet. To his astonishment, is painful. Infection has vanished. He relieves himself free from the previous discomfort. It appears that John, despite his intimidating appearance, possesses extraordinary abilities, including the power to perceive others' intentions and miraculously heal health issues. Returning home, Paul is overjoyed to discover he can again be intimate with his wife thanks to the miraculous healing from his infection by John. He tells her about the incredible act of kindness John delivered on him. Feeling grateful, Paul dials up Brutus, requesting a day off. He has a plan to return John's kindness by seeking justice for him. He's convinced that John's character is too gentle to commit such an awful crime as child murder, for which he's been convicted. Paul arranges a meeting with Bert Hammersmith, John's former attorney, hoping to convince him to advocate for a new trial for John. But Bert is skeptical. He tells Paul a story of his own about his family dog, once thought to be a good dog. It suddenly attacked Bert's son for no reason. In response, Bert had to make the hard choice to put his dog down. Bert implies that John's situation is no different. Outward appearances and behaviors don't necessarily reflect a person's true nature. It's clear Bert is convinced of John's guilt. Undeterred, Paul brings John a small gesture of appreciation. The next day, some homemade bread that his wife baked. John happily receives the bread, sharing it with Edward and Mr. Jingles. However, John pointedly ignores Wild Bill. The tension hints at John's intuitive understanding of Wild Bill's true nature. The following day, Edward learns the date of his execution. He asks the officers to take care of his mouse. Mr. Jingles, however, in a cruel twist, Percy steps on Mr. Jingles, badly hurting him. Edward is heartbroken, but John intervenes. He asks Paul to place Mr. Jingles in his hands. John breathes into Mr. Jingles, and miraculously, Mr. Jingles recovers the guard's watch, astounded by the supernatural display. It's becoming increasingly clear that John possesses the power to heal. The scene ends with a shift in the guard's perspective as they grapple with the reality that John, who's been painted as a child murderer, might actually be innocent. The heartbreaking time finally arrives. It's the day of Edward's execution, as Edward is secured in the electric chair. Percy purposely neglects to wet the sponge that's meant to be placed on Edward's head, a crucial step to ensure a quick death. Paul catches this misstep and attempts to halt the execution, but Percy swiftly signals another officer to throw the switch. The result is horrifying. Edward suffers intensely and even catches fire alive in his cell. John seems to feel the energy of Edward's agony in the aftermath of the horrific execution. Percy claims ignorance about the crucial role of the wet sponge, expressing false regret over the incident. The next day, the guards gather at Paul's house during a meal. The topic of discussion turns to John's healing powers. Paul tells them how John healed his infection and Mr. Jingles. He suggests a daring plan to sneak John out of prison to heal the warden's wife, Melinda, who suffers from a fatal brain tumor. After some persuasion, Paul manages to get the others on board with this risky plan to ensure their mission stays undetected by Wild Bill and Percy, who they can't trust. Paul takes careful steps. He spoils Wild Bill's drink with sleeping pills and locks Percy in an isolation cell, a justified punishment for his actions during Edward's execution. With these obstacles out of the way, they sneak John out of the prison and into a truck. They drive to Hall's house, where they're initially met with suspicion. Hall threatens them with a shotgun, fearing a prison escape. But once he understands their intention, he allows them in. John proceeds to where Melinda is resting. As he approaches Melinda, something odd happens. Something visibly leaves her body and enters John's incredibly. Melinda sits up, looking completely healthy. The guards with John return to the prison, having accomplished their daring mission. Back in prison, Percy is released from his confinement. As he walks past John's cell, John reaches out, grabs him through the bars and presses his mouth against Percy's. He releases the weird substance he took from Melinda, effectively transferring all the illness into Percy, who they all know to be an evil individual. John then releases him, leaving Percy to bear the consequences of the illness. Now, under a strange control, Percy lifts his gun and fires straight into Wild Bill's chest, ending his life. Afterward, Percy coughs up those bizarre things John once held in his mouth. Paul, confused by all this, asks John for an explanation. John tells him that Wild Bill and Percy were evil men deserving of their fate. In a surprising gesture, John extends his hands toward Paul, offering him the chance to see into his memories. Accepting the offer, Paul finds himself seeing what John sees. He finds himself on the farm where the two murdered girls lived. He sees Wild Bill sneaking into their room one night and kidnapping them. The truth strikes Paul like a thunderbolt. It was Wild Bill, not John, who was responsible for the horrific double murder that got John condemned. After this vision ends, John confirms to a horrified Paul that it was indeed Wild Bill who committed the awful crime. Soon after, Warden Hall and the police arrive at the prison for his deadly act. Percy is arrested and sent to a mental institution as his mind has severely deteriorated since the strange episode. The next day, Paul and the others sit down to speak with John. They even ask him if he wants to be set free. But John refuses to run away. Not wanting to put his guard friends in any danger, he reveals that besides healing, he carries a unique burden. He can feel the sadness of everyone around him, and he doesn't wish to continue living in a world filled with such pain and darkness, even if it means his execution for a crime he didn't commit. When Paul asks if John has any last requests, John shares a simple wish he's always wanted to watch a movie. They bring in a movie projector and play a film, the same film that stirred up intense memories for the elderly. Paul at the beginning of the movie. It's a bittersweet moment that underscores the tragedy of John's impending fate. The day arrives that they all are terrified of John's execution. The guards, tears streaming down their faces, guide him to the execution room. Despite their heavy hearts, they must perform their duty as John is secured to the chair. Paul ensures that he isn't blindfolded, since John fears the dark, checking that the sponge is soaked. Paul places the cap on John's head, aiming to make his end as swift and painless as possible. Paul reaches out and shakes John's hand before giving the command to activate the chair. This act marks their last execution, leading Paul and some guards to leave their prison duty behind, unable to bear the guilt of having executed an innocent man. After finishing his heart-wrenching tale, the elderly Paul guides Elaine into the woods where they stumble upon a cabin. Incredibly, they find Mr. Jingles the mouse still alive after all these years, a feat that seems impossible. Paul reveals that he is 108 years old, attributing his long life to John's touch. He and Mr. Jingles were given the gift of longevity, a life that seemingly doesn't end. But to Paul, this isn't a gift. He views it as his punishment for having executed John. He's destined to watch everyone he cares for grow old and die while he remains unchanged. As the movie concludes, Paul is left alone, having seen every loved one pass away, bearing the pain of their loss.